Hello and welcome to another episode of the Beer Chronicles. My window is open today, so I apologise in advance if you hear any background noise, but I'm not closing it because it's bloody hot today, especially with a studio light pointing at my face. So yeah, just consider yourself lucky that I'm not turning the fan on because it's really tempting right now, but yeah, we're just going to have to make do with that because it's fucking hot. Anyway, today's video is a very special video because it is the first episode of the Beer Chronicles that has been suggested by someone else. This video was actually suggested to me by a friend of mine. His name's Richard. Hi, Rich. And what we're going to talk about today is my top 10 favourite video game franchises. As we talk about them, I am going to be drinking Newcastle Brown Ale, and the reason I'm going to be drinking Newcastle Brown Ale today is because he actually also suggested the drink. I think the reason he actually suggested this one was because he doesn't like it, and he wants to watch me drink a bad drink. He wants to watch me suffer, basically. But the joke's on you, Richard, because I have drunk Newcastle Brown Ale before, and I actually have fond memories of the Nuki Brown. So this perhaps won't be as bad for me as you were hoping. Yeah, during my younger years, when I used to go and boogie down at the club, this was typically the bottled beer that I'd buy while I was there. The reason I bought this one was because they didn't have a lot of good options, I'll admit that. But no, this was a staple for me at that time, and you know, I'll admit it wasn't the best drink I'd ever had, but I liked it fine. Bitter, sharp, hoppy. It's a very potent flavour. I mean, I can understand if someone isn't used to that flavour profile, then they might find this horrible, because if you're not yet used to those bitter flavours, this is really potent, and this definitely isn't it isn't a gateway ale. You might want to start a bit milder and work your way up to this if you're not used to the more bitter flavours. But for someone with such an experienced palate as myself, it's absolutely fine. I actually quite enjoy it. So thank you very much for your suggestion, Dick. And also, if any of you would like to recommend a topic for me to talk about, then please do feel free to leave it in a comment down below. Let me know what you'd like me to talk about, and I will at least consider every one that I read. And also, if you've spotted any beers on this poster, say in the intro, and I haven't drunk them yet, feel free to suggest which one you'd like me to drink with your topic. If I can do it, and if I'm willing to talk about your topic, then yeah, it's very much a possibility. So please do that. And if you want to find out whether or not I've done it, then you're gonna have to subscribe to the channel, people. So get on that. Also, leave a like while you're there. Anyway, let's get into today's topic. As suggested by Richard, I am going to be talking about my top 10 game franchises of all time. He actually did suggest my top 10 games of all time, but if I left it as just games, then half the list would be Devil May Cry. It's going to be no surprise to any of you that that is on the list, because I've mentioned in previous videos that it is my favourite game franchise, so that's not really a surprise for anyone. Whether or not the rest will be a surprise remains to be seen. This wasn't very easy for me, actually. I had a very tough time narrowing it down to 10. I did originally plan for this to be the last video that I did, but instead I ended up talking about Spider-Man. Because when I was ready to film that day, I still hadn't completed this list, and I'd started this list before then. But I've been focusing on this for days, trying to narrow it down to just 10, and it got to the point where I got it down to 11, and I was just stuck on which one to get rid of because I really didn't want to get rid of any of them. This almost ended up being a top 11, but I thought that's a bit of a cop-out, so I forced myself to get it down to a top 10, and I have a top 10 now. But full disclosure, this, like any other of my favourite anything, is subject to constant change, depending on how good new games are that come out, although most of these are older games, but also what mood I'm in. Sometimes I'm more in the mood for a different type of game, and so that'll knock certain games up and down the list. and that will also knock whatever's in 11, 12 up, whatever's in 9, 10 down, and sometimes my top 10 list will just change. But right now, as it stands, I've got my official top 10 list for now, and as tricky it was to make it, I'm going to stick with it. Now, I'm sorry, Richard. I'm very, very sorry about this, because originally you did want me to rank my top 10, and as I said, just picking a top 10 was difficult enough, and they constantly change order, so I could not, for the life of me, rank these from 10 to 1. That was impossible, so I'm just doing my top 10, but they are in no particular order. There is only one franchise on this list that I am absolutely certain about where it's placed, and you'll all know what it is already. Devil May Cry at the top, my number one favourite. Normally you save your absolute favourite until last, but we all know what it is, so why bother trying to build suspense? So yeah, as this is in no particular order, I'm just going to get that one out of the way now. Devil May Cry, number one, favourite game franchise of all time. One of the most important to me. It really has shaped what I like in video games, just in general. I can actually remember the first time I was ever introduced to the first Devil May Cry game. I used to go around my brother's house every week or so, and I'd stop there for the night, and one time when I went round there, he'd got this new game, and it was Devil May Cry, and he wanted to show it me, so I watched him play it. And I watched him play the first few levels. We got up to about the first Phantom fight, and I absolutely fell in love with what I was seeing. And a short while later, I got Resident Evil Code Veronica X for the PS2, and that came with a demo disc of Devil May Cry. So I got to play a couple of levels. It started from mission 2 instead of from mission 1, which is weird, but I remember playing that demo constantly over and over and over again and really, really enjoying it. And when I started playing that demo, I just thought to myself, I already know that I love this game. Now I've got this demo, I can't stop playing it. Why haven't I got the game yet? And so I got my brother to go online and order me the actual game from play.com, which is a website I haven't even thought about in years. And I don't think it even exists anymore, at least not in the state that it was back then, which, it used to be a really, really good website. I don't think it's what it was now anymore. But yeah, ordered it from there, and it arrived, and I played through it and absolutely loved it. Then, when Devil May Cry 2 came out, it was so unadvertised. I didn't even realise that it existed until one day I was at a supermarket with my mum. It was actually an Asda, and we were walking through the video game aisle, and I saw Devil May Cry 2 on the shelf. I was like, there's a second one? Since when? And, I was a child at the time, so what do? Mum, buy me that, please. So, yeah, I got that then, and it wasn't as good as the first. But you know what? I still like Devil May Cry 2, and I have talked about this in an earlier Beer Chronicles video, so I recommend you go watch that if you want to hear my defence of Devil May Cry 2, because it is a good game, just not as good as the other games in the franchise, but still better than a lot of games that aren't in the Devil May Cry franchise. And I won't go in detail about every game in the franchise, because that'll just take too long, but Devil May Cry 3, I very much knew that was coming out. That was advertised to shit in all the PlayStation magazines, which I used to collect, and yeah, I was really, really excited about that, and that did not disappoint at all. And then Devil May Cry 4 I was really, really excited about, and half disappointed and half didn't. It's weird. It was one of the best games of the time in terms of how it actually felt to play, but the story itself very much seemed unfinished, particularly the second half when you start playing as Dante instead of Nero, and you're just going back through the levels that Nero had already been through and fighting the same bosses. And yeah, you could very much tell that they wanted to do other things and just didn't have time to do it, and it was a very unfinished game. But In terms of the actual mechanics of the game, very, very fun to play. One of the best in that aspect for the time that it came out. And then we won't talk about the reboot, but then Devil May Cry 5 came out, and possibly, probably, certainly the best game of all time. In my opinion, obviously this is very, very subjective, but for me personally, Devil May Cry 5 is my favourite game ever. Hands down, fucking amazing. Anyway, moving on, because this is supposed to be a top 10 list and I'm still stuck on number 1. But obviously I love Devil May Cry so much that I was going to gush about it a bit. As I'm a big fan of Devil May Cry, it won't come as any surprise that I'm a fan of this next one, because it's a very similar style of game, going through hack and slash, all that stuff. It's God of War. I absolutely love the God of War games. I've loved the God of War games since God of War 1, again, introduced to that through demo when I was collecting the PlayStation magazines. Played the demo, which was the first level, and it ends with the Hydra fight. And I thought, this is amazing. It looks absolutely phenomenal. It plays absolutely phenomenal. And I go back to it now, and it doesn't look quite so phenomenal anymore because the graphics haven't aged well. But I remember, it's weird because at the time you play it now and think, this looks like shit. But at the time when it came out, that was one of the best games visually that I'd ever seen. It's weird how things age like that. Like, you play it at the time and you think, this looks almost real. And then you play it now and you think, this looks shit. But no, for the time it came out, it looked very, very good. And obviously the newer games are ones that hold up to this day in terms of graphics. Always been a strong point with the God of War games. For every game that's come out, for the platform it's been on and the time that it's been released, it's always been one of the best looking games at that moment. And I'm a massive, massive fan of the original God of War series. And the new one that came out is an absolutely phenomenal game. But they obviously changed the gameplay quite a bit. They set it in Norse mythology instead of Greek mythology, but it wasn't a reboot as such. It did carry on from the original storyline. And it is an absolutely amazing game, and I truly, truly love it. But I can't quite work out whether I prefer it over the originals or not, because I am a big fan of the old style of gameplay as well. It's one of those where they're both great for different reasons, and they're both masters of what they do, so it's hard to say which one's actually better. They're both great for different reasons, so yeah. There isn't a God of War game that I don't like. They're all amazing games, all top tier, best at what they do, and it is definitely one of my favourite game franchises of all time. Also, I do have a little bit of an interest in Greek mythology. I do think that Greek mythology is very interesting, and a lot of the stories that are told are very, very fun. And so that adds to my enjoyment of God of War, because obviously it's centred around that, and you actually get to sort of experience a fair bit of Greek mythology intertwined in your own story. Just personally, to me, I find that interesting. So that's another thing that really draws me into that series. More so than the reboot, because I don't really know a lot about Norse mythology, although it is the sort of thing that I would like to know more about. I just haven't actually got around to doing any research in that area yet. But I am quite keen on Greek mythology, and so that's one of the main factors that drew me into the original series and what got me to love the game so much to begin with. That and the boobs. Okay, which one should I do next? No particular order. Not a lot of people expect me to be a fan of horror at all. I often come across as someone who doesn't care for horror, and anyone would be forgiven for thinking that I just dislike horror. The reason I come across that way is because modern horror just tends to be a load of jump scares, and that's all it really is nowadays. And I don't like that, and I also don't really consider that to be horror. To me, that's not what horror even is. That's just startling people, and there is a massive difference between being scary and horrifying and just being startling. If you've been startled, if something just goes boo and it makes you jump, you haven't been scared. That's not what being scared is. Scared is a feeling, an emotion, not a reaction. If someone creeps up to you and goes boo, you go ah, and then it's over. And in that moment, you were startled, and then you carry on with your day and you don't think about it again. If you get scared, then after that moment is done, you continue on for a short while at least with a feeling of dread that is now embedded into you as a result of what you've just experienced. It's a sort of emotion that doesn't immediately die out. You get this feeling that persists for a while. That's what true horror is, just this feeling of inner dread, and that's what true horror does. And when it's done well, it can be very, very effective, and I can actually quite enjoy it. So even though I don't come across as a fan of horror, I am a fan of horror when it's done right. It's just a lot of people present me with horror and I don't like it, and then they assume he's just not a horror fan. And I'm like, no, I am a horror fan. It's just what you've shown me is not horror. It's just startling. And if you want horror, if you want a true experience of what it's like to have a horror video game, a game that fills you with a feeling of dread and terror and depression and just this really negative but in a good way feeling that persists well after you've played the game, then you need go no further than the early Silent Hill games. Now, obviously, since they got took over by an American company, they aren't as good anymore as the originals. So even though this is my top franchises of all time, I don't really consider the whole franchise to be in my top 10. I really consider the first two games to be in the top 10. And the reason I say top 2 and not like top 4 or anything like that is because I haven't actually personally played Silent Hill 3 or Silent Hill 4. Silent Hill 4 I am unsure on. It could be very, very great, or it could be terrible, because I know the concept of it and it's very different to the 3 games that came before it. So I would have to play that before I could even know whether or not I'm going to like it. Silent Hill 3, however, I haven't played, but I'm pretty sure it would match 1 and 2. It's the same sort of game, made by the same people, and it gets high praise, and I'm pretty sure it's warranted. So I would assume that Silent Hill 3 would also fit in with the franchise that I stick in the top 10. Silent Hill 4, I don't know. It could very well, possibly also couldn't, depending. I have played Origins actually on the PSP, and that was pretty good as well. I did enjoy that for what it was. It had its faults, but for a handheld portable Silent Hill experience, it was fairly decent. I actually quite enjoyed it. But yeah, those early games, a true representation of horror, and also just ingenuity for the time that they came out and the sort of limits that they had. They turned those into their strength. Things like not being able to see really far ahead of you because of the render distance of the hardware they had to work with, and so they just hide the distance in fog so that you don't see that the distance isn't loading yet, and using that fog to create an atmosphere, and then switching to the other world of Silent Hill where it's no longer fog, it's darkness, but still done for the same reasons, that you don't have to see too far ahead of you, but also then having this tool that they can use to invoke feelings of isolation and claustrophobia and, you know, dread. It's truly genius. The first 2 are great, and I'm sure the third one is as well, but for me personally, the reason why I've put this franchise in the top 10 is mainly because of Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 is its own story. It doesn't really fit in with Silent Hill 1 or Silent Hill 3, which is a sequel to Silent Hill 1. It's its own thing. It's set in the same town and it's canon to the rest of the stuff. It's not like they just ignored the other game and said that didn't happen, this is its own thing in its own timeline. The other games still happen, it's just they're not really relevant to each other. It's the same town, but with a different set of events going on within it. And the story told in that one standalone game of Silent Hill 2 is one of the best stories I've ever seen presented in a video game format. It is truly astounding, and I consider it to be a work of art. I really, really do. It's a story that I played back when I was a teenager for the first time and has stuck with me to this day. I truly, truly adore the story of Silent Hill 2 and the way that Team Silent presents the story to you. Honestly, by now, if anyone's considering playing it, they've probably already played it by now. But if you haven't played Silent Hill 2 and you're not fully against horror, I highly, highly recommend going back and playing 2. But if you do not play the HD collection version. They absolutely butchered it on that. Find the original PS2 copy and play that. Next up, here's a game I don't hear enough about on the internet, and I don't know why, because it's truly brilliant. That game is Dark Chronicle. You may or may not have heard of it. Based on how little I hear of it on the internet, I'm going to assume you haven't. It's the second game in the Dark Cloud franchise. It's Dark Cloud 2 outside of Europe, but within Europe it's Dark Chronicle. It's just a really, really good game, and I would put the Dark Cloud franchise in the top 10. I'm sure I would if I'd actually played the first Dark Cloud, which I haven't yet. I do have it downloaded on my PlayStation 4, so I do plan to play it at some point. But for now, because I haven't played it, I can't put it in the top 10 because that wouldn't make sense. So for now, it's just Dark Chronicle that's in my top 10. But Dark Chronicle is absolutely amazing. It's a fun story being told with these beautiful cel-shaded animation, anime-style characters. It's kind of difficult to work out whether the game is designed for children or for adults, because the story and the art style is sort of presented as if it's for children, but the actual gameplay can be quite complicated for a child, so it's hard to tell where it fits on that scale. But whoever it's aimed at, it's sort of perfectly aimed itself towards me, it seems, because I truly, truly adore this game. There's so many things to do in the game. If you're not happy doing one thing, or you get bored doing a particular thing too many times, there's always something else that you can move on to and do instead. It's essentially a dungeon crawler, but as you progress through the game and crawl through dungeons, you find items and such which you then use outside of the dungeons to rebuild towns in the present, to change the future. And then there's a time travel mechanic where you travel from the present to the future, where these towns in the future have been destroyed because their origin has been wiped by the villain. And so you are basically recreating their origin. That's the point of the story. So when you travel to the future, you see these barren places that used to be towns but no longer are because they've been destroyed through time. And then as you start rebuilding the town, you can travel back to the future to see how the changes you've made have affected the future, and eventually when you finish remaking the origin point in the present, the future will be fully developed to what it once was. And this is how you progress through the main story for the most part. So the town building is its own sort of thing, which is quite fun to do. But then there's also the dungeon crawling itself with the battle mechanics, leveling up, upgrading weapons, synchronizing items to increase certain abilities of your weapons. And when you increase the right abilities, you can then upgrade your weapon to a different type of weapon. There's also recruiting people to your team, so they join you, and then you can choose one of them to come with you through dungeons, and they give you certain perks to your characters. There's a fishing minigame, there's a golf minigame. There's so many different things to do, and then there's so many different towns that you go to throughout the game. You have to rebuild the origin point in the present to fix the future of them, and it's just You see so many different locations in both an incomplete and fully complete way, in both the present and the future. So there's so many stunning areas to see. And the actual storyline itself is really fun. I can't really talk any more about it without completely gushing over it. Also, the main villain is voiced by Mark Hamill, so that immediately gives it a plus. So yeah, ever since I played Dark Chronicle back when I was young, it's always been one of my favourite games. Still is to this day, and it's in my top 10, absolutely, without a doubt. Next up, the Metal Gear Solid franchise. Absolutely love the Metal Gear Solid franchise. One of my favourites. I actually didn't start with Metal Gear Solid 1 or even any of the original Metal Gears. I started, oddly enough, with Metal Gear Solid 2. And the reason I started with 2 is because a friend of mine at school lent me the game to play because he is a big fan of Metal Gear Solid himself and wanted me to get into it. He said, here, play this, you'll love it. And he's like, I'll give you 2 first. And he actually told me why. He told me that you play as Raiden in the game, and if any of you watching are a fan of Metal Gear Solid, you'll understand why that's important. So he said you play as Raiden in this, and the main character that you normally play as throughout the whole series is Solid Snake, and if you play number 1 first and then play number 2, you'll be pissed off that you're playing as Raiden. So he gave me Metal Gear Solid 2 to play so that I was playing as Raiden and didn't realise that that was a bad thing, but I genuinely don't think it's a bad thing. But I think the reason I don't think is a bad thing could also be because I played 2 first, so he might have known what he was talking about when he did that. I assume he knew what he was talking about because I ended up loving the franchise as a result of it. Metal Gear Solid 2, actually, I don't know how people are going to react to me saying this, and this might be because it was the first one I ever played, but it's actually one of my favourites of the whole franchise. I do think that the story of Metal Gear Solid 2 is fucking bizarre, I'll give you that. And it's a lot to get your head around. But once you actually manage to get your head around what the fuck's going on, it is genius. And it is truly one of the most well thought out Metal Gear Solid games ever. People point out a lot of negatives. I don't agree with playing as Raiden being a negative. I don't think that is a negative. I understand why the makers of the game wanted to make you play as Raiden, and I do see where they're coming from. It's because Solid Snake is still in this game and they wanted you to see him through someone else's eyes, and if you're new to the game and playing it as well, which is always a possibility, and so you're not maybe as good as someone who's played through the early games, or just not as good as someone would expect Snake to be. It'd be weird if you're going through the game struggling to get through and then everyone in the cutscenes are talking about how great you are, and it's like, you're just like, no, I'm not really though, am I? But you play as Raiden, and it doesn't matter how well or how shit you play, Snake is presented to you as a god tier veteran of this sort of shit, and they wanted you to see that through the eyes of someone else. And I do fully understand that, and I actually don't think it's a bad idea. I think it worked pretty well for the most part. I just think the reason people got salty about it is because they decided to leave it as a surprise, to the point where the trailers made it seem like you were going to play as Snake. The demos that came out for the game made it seem like you were going to play as Snake, and you didn't know you were playing as Raiden until the actual game was released and you played it. That was a bit of a dick move. I do understand that they wanted to shock you with that, but at the same time, people who are loyal to the franchise aren't going to like that. It was a bold move, but it didn't affect me that much because I hadn't played Metal Gear Solid 1 at that point, so I was fine with it. But I do think if it was advertised as a story where you play as a different character, then the reception to it would have been a lot better. But the actual game itself is quality. To say it was one of the launch titles for the PlayStation 2, it stood the test of time for years after that. I mean, a few years later, when more technically advanced games than the original starting lineup came out, but Metal Gear Solid 2, out of all the starting lineup games, did seem to sort of hold its ground against some of these later games that came out. I wouldn't say all the way till the console's end. I mean, it's still good and technically astounding in many ways, but then when you think the end of the PlayStation 2 lineup had things like God of War 2, you compare that to Metal Gear Solid 2 and then there's no comparison technically speaking, then yeah. But to say it was a launch title, it was truly a magnificent example of what this new console could do. It really, really showed off the capabilities of the console. And it was just a really good game, and still one of my favourites in the whole franchise. But then, since then, I have gone back and played Metal Gear Solid 1, and that's also one of my favourites. Most people's favourite is Metal Gear Solid 3, and for good reason, because there's so much shit you can do in that game. It's beautiful. Not personally my favourite of the franchise, but still absolutely love it. And then a lot of people do have a problem with 4. I don't. I like 4. I think 4 is a really good game. Metal Gear Solid 5, I still haven't actually finished, but what I've played of it, I think the actual gameplay is absolutely phenomenal. One of the most technically advanced games that we've ever had. It's just there's almost too much to do, to the point where I get easily sidetracked by more sort of focused games. And I never got round to finishing Metal Gear Solid 5, unfortunately. That's one of the reasons, actually, I'm not really a big fan. I mean, I do enjoy a load of open world games, but I'm not really a massive fan of the open world sandbox style game. I tend to lean towards more linear game titles because I tend to finish them more, and I do like the feeling of completion, of having made progress in my game. Every time I go on the game, if I get through at least one level, I've made progress, and you get less of that feeling in a big open world sandbox game. You can do a load of shit in one session and not actually progress at all, and I very rarely finish it, and that satisfying feeling of finishing a game really, it heightens my experience of the game. And that's why I tend to lean more towards linear titles. So even though gameplay wise Metal Gear Solid 5 is absolutely astounding, I wouldn't put it as one of my favourites of the franchise, purely because it was so open that I haven't finished it yet, whereas something like Metal Gear Solid 1, which is technically the worst because it was on an inferior console, is one of the best because it's linear, and I've played it multiple times, and yet there's still a lot to do for the time that it came out, and it's just a brilliant story, and that is key to me. I do enjoy games with a really good story, and a lot of the games in the Metal Gear Solid franchise have a good story, and one in particular was a more simple but wonderful story. 2 was an absolutely bonkers complicated story, but wonderful nonetheless once you manage to get your head around it. We're halfway through the list. Because we're halfway through the list, actually, I am going to choose now. And it wasn't planned that it would be now, but it's going to be now. But I'm going to run through some of my honourable mentions. If I was actually sort of doing it in order so that my favourite would be the last one I said, then the honourable mentions probably would have just been, the penultimate mention. But seeing as the last one on my list isn't going to be anything more special than the others, so it's not my favourite of all, there's no point slipping the honourable mentions in just before that, so I'll stick it here in the middle, because why not? The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. This game was on the list for the longest time. It's one of those ones that I couldn't decide whether or not to take it off to make way for a different game. It was going to be on the list for so long, but in the end, when I was down to like 11 games, I had to get rid of something, and it took me the longest time to get rid of something, but in the end I decided to knock The Witcher 3 down, and the only reason that The Witcher 3 didn't make it on the top 10 is because the other 10 games made it on the top 10. If it wasn't for the fact that I have played a lot of games in my life and a lot of them are good, then The Witcher 3 would have made it in the top 10 because it is a phenomenal game. It truly, truly is. But unfortunately, there were just other games as well that also had to make it into the top 10, and it was a really, really tough decision because it felt like The Witcher 3 should be in this list, but I just had to get rid of something, so in the end it just ended up becoming an honourable mention. But my god, did I want it to be in the top 10. The Batman Arkham series, truly wonderful series of games. When I first started writing this list, it was definitely on there. before I eventually narrowed it down to 10. I basically just started off by writing every franchise that even had a possibility, and then deleted the ones that definitely weren't going to get into the top 10, and then narrowed it down from there. After the ones that weren't going to make it were deleted, the Batman Arkham series was one of the ones that was still on the list as a potential, and it was quite strong and on there for a while until eventually I had to get rid of it. But I thought I'd mention it because I'm a fan of Batman, particularly a fan of the Joker, and obviously the Arkham series is one that uses the Joker quite a lot, voiced by Mark Hamill, who is the best Joker and in one of the best roles he's done as the Joker as well. The gameplay is wonderful with the use of the detective mode and the combat and everything, and the combat in the Arkham series has really been a staple of action-based video games going forward. A lot of games have borrowed from it because it was a truly wonderful, revolutionary way of doing combat in games. So I thought I should mention it for that. The Harry Potter games on PlayStation 1. There are a lot of technically better games on the later consoles, but the PlayStation 1 games, that being the Philosopher's Stone and the Chamber of Secrets, they are games that I've played on this channel with my friend Aidan. Watch them if you like. I grew up playing these games and absolutely adore them to this day, and I'm just a really big fan of them, so I just really wanted to give them an honourable mention. Although when compared to everything else on the list, they were never going to make it into the top 10, but I just really wanted to just mention them, so they're here in the honourable mentions. Legacy of Kain series, particularly the Soul Reaver games. I love Raziel as a character more so than Kain, and I do think the whole lore behind the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver series and the whole plot going through with all the time travel aspects and everything, and I can't really get too much into it because that in itself would make a full-length video. It's really hard to narrow all that down into just like a minute or so of conversation, so I'm not even going to fucking bother. Just truly wonderful story and lore, and absolutely love it. So yeah, definitely want to give that an honourable mention. Marvel's Spider-Man. I haven't played the Miles Morales game yet. I'm waiting until I eventually get a PlayStation 5 so I can play it in its best possible version. But the original Marvel Spider-Man, absolutely phenomenal game. Another one that was really, really close to actually making it on the top 10 list, but unfortunately just fell short because of the other 10 games that were on the list. But it was a really strong contender and very nearly made it on there, and I absolutely adore the game. The best Spider-Man game, hands down, that we've ever had. The best superhero game I think that we've ever had, I'd say. The combat is very similar to the Batman Arkham series, but I think it actually works better in a Spider-Man game because the whole, glow around your head to show that an attack is coming so you can counter it really fits in more with the Spider-Man character than it does with the Batman character, because it does mimic his spider sense perfectly. Graphics are amazing, the roster of villains are great, the story being told actually is very, very well done in that it introduces the origins of some of these villains, and other ones are just there, but it introduces the origins of some villains as if, this is how they came to be, even though it's more of a veteran Spider-Man. So some of these you'd expect to come up earlier on in his story normally, but obviously this Marvel Spider-Man video game is set in its own sort of timeline, and so they're making their own sort of origins of these characters, and it's just a really, really well done, well told story. Absolutely worth checking out for any Marvel fan, particularly for any Spider-Man fan, any video game fan for that matter. It's a wonderful video game. The web swinging mechanic is the best that we've had in any Spider-Man game so far, and it's just a joy to control while swinging through the city. It's one of those games that I was really looking forward to playing, but thought I'm not going to spend the money on it yet. I'll wait a while when it first came out. And then I started to watch a playthrough online on YouTube. I believe it was Jacksepticeye that I started watching play it. And when he started the game and he started swinging through the city, it's weird. He was swinging through the city and my hands just sort of wanted to be holding the controller and pressing all the buttons as it was happening. And at that point I was just like, nope, that's it, stop the video, didn't want to watch anymore, went out and got the game the next day. I had to play it, and I've never regretted it since. It was a truly, truly wonderful game. And again, so close to being in the top 10 of all time, but just fell short only because of the other games on the list. Sonic the Hedgehog. When I talked in a previous video about video game mascots, I mentioned in that video that Sonic the Hedgehog was a big part of my youth. When I was a child, I used to have the Sega Master System and the Sega Mega Drive consoles, and I played Sonic games a lot, almost religiously. And so they were really important games to me. And I was kind of surprised when I started making this top 10 list how soon they got took out of the running. But the main reason that they never really stood a chance of being in the actual top 10 is because even though there are a handful of truly, truly great games, there's just been so many disappointments since that really it's hard to say that the Sonic franchise is that great. And it's a shame to say that. But I did want to give it an honourable mention because of the handful of games that are truly spectacular. And lastly on my honourable mentions is the Worms games, because they were just so much fun. I used to play these on my home PC when I was a child all the fucking time, and I absolutely adored it. If you haven't played Worms, play Worms. You will have the absolute time of your life, you really will. It's fun, it's hilarious, it's brilliant, just warfare between worms. What could go wrong? Anyway, now that the honourable mentions are out of the way, let's carry on with the main list. The next one in my top 10 is actually very recent. This one isn't really a franchise yet, there is only one game in it, and it's a very modern game. So it's surprising to see something like that make it into my top 10, because this is so good that it has sort of overridden a lot of the games that I consider to be great due to repetition and nostalgia. It's overridden all of that. It came in strong, played it once, and it's immediately in my top 10 best of all time, so that goes to show you just how good it is. That game is Ghost of Tsushima. Truly phenomenal game, absolutely gorgeous, brilliant visuals. The whole game is just stunning to look at, but not only that, it plays spectacularly as well. And the different ways that you can play it, you can go through, you have to clear places of enemies, but you don't necessarily just have to go up and fight them all head to head. You can also sneak in and assassinate them stealthily, and the two different aspects are both executed really, really well. The game obviously didn't just focus on one and stick to that, it gave equal time to both and made them both as good as they could be. The story is absolutely wonderful. The choice you have to make at the end, I was stuck on that choice for like a good solid 10 minutes before I decided what to do. It's not very clear cut which is the right or wrong ending. I won't spoil what the ending actually is because it's still a fairly recent game and some people may not have played it yet, but you know, it's a difficult choice, and in the end I made my choice and I stand by it, but whew, it was difficult. Yeah, the whole game is just an absolutely wonderful experience. It is one of those rare games where once you get the majority of trophies or achievements or whatever you want to call it for them, normally at that point when I'm just finishing up getting trophies for a game, the last few trophies tend to be more sort of grindy type things or collectibles, and they tend to be the more sort of, you know, boring trophies that you don't really like doing, but you do it because they're the last ones for you to get that platinum, you know. But this is one of those rare few games where not only did I enjoy the story from start to finish, but I didn't get bored finishing off the last few trophies either. And not only that, once I'd platinumed the game, I still didn't want to stop playing it. It was still fun to play even at that point, even though I'd done everything. You can't play a game to full completion and still want to play more of it and not say it's one of the best games of all time, because it clearly is. Next on the list, and this is an obvious one, Pokemon. Of course, Pokemon is one of my top 10 favourite game franchises of all time. There are so many Pokemon games that you are bound to hit gold with some of them. One of them is even fucking called Gold. I'm a big fan of the Pokemon games. I've been playing them since the original Red and Blue on the Game Boy Color. Well, I say the original Red and Blue. The original was Red and Green in Japan, but, you know, I'm not Japanese, so I didn't play that. But, you know, our original, been playing them since then, and I have just loved them every step of the way. Even more recently with Sword and Shield on the Switch, which was set in a region based here in the UK. There were police sirens and they were ruining my video. But yeah, a lot of people had issues with those games because they didn't have the full Pokemon decks on there, and I understand why that's a problem for a lot of people. For me, it was fine. I'm never the type who manages to complete my decks anyway, so it didn't matter all that much to me, and to be honest, I'm fine sacrificing some Pokemon if in return we get better gameplay for it, and I think the gameplay to Pokemon Sword and Shield was absolutely stellar, and so I am absolutely down for that. I'll even go as far as to say that Sword and Shield, well, Sword is the one I played. I haven't actually played Shield, but it's the same game really. But yeah, I'd even go as far as to say that those games probably the best so far. They play really well. Although I do understand why the lack of a complete dex is a problem for certain types of Pokemon players, and I do sympathise with them, but I don't necessarily empathise with them. But yeah, the whole franchise in general is just a wonderful franchise, even outside of the video games. I love the anime, and you know, I collect some of the trading cards, and it's Pokemon. It's Pokemon, of course it's in the top 10. Next up, Prince of Persia, specifically the Sands trilogy. This is the Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and the Two Thrones. Absolutely adore those games. Two Thrones is the weakest of the three, but still a good game. Sands of Time is the one that everyone raves about, and why is it taking them so long to get that fucking remaster out? I want it now. But yeah, even though Sands of Time is regarded as this 10 out of 10 masterpiece game, Warrior Within's my favourite. Warrior Within is actually the reason that the Sands trilogy is on this top 10 list. If it was just Sands of Time and Two Thrones, well, not only would the story not make sense, but, you know, if it was just, you know, the gameplay of those two, then I would like it, but it wouldn't be in the top 10. But Warrior Within, if we weren't just doing franchises, we were just doing video games, then Warrior Within would stand a good chance of being in the top 10 games of all time, if not for the fact that half the list would be taken up by Devil May Cry games. Yeah, I absolutely adore Warrior Within. It was actually the first game I ever got with my PlayStation 2, because it came with the PlayStation 2, that's how I can remember that. I played it when I was a teenager, so the sort of more dark, brooding, mature Prince, as opposed to what he was like in the Sands of Time, that was more aesthetically pleasing to me at that stage in my life. But even now, as an adult, I prefer that version of the Prince over the original. Again, that's very subjective, though. I can understand why people would prefer the Prince in the original game as opposed to the one in Warrior Within. For me personally, I prefer the one in Warrior Within, but, you know, I can give a take either. They're both, you know, great characters, but for me, what truly seals it is the combat. In the original Prince of Persia Sands of Time, the combat was so bad that I'm surprised that so many people give that game 10 out of 10. Because even before Warrior Within came out, if I was playing and reviewing the Sands of Time, I would have said this is a great game, but it's let down by its combat. Because the fact that you have to finish off every enemy by stabbing it with the dagger is just a ball ache, an absolute ball ache, and luckily they got rid of that mechanic in Warrior Within. The combat is just so much better in that game. You just fight them normally until they die. You can pick up a secondary weapon and fight two-handed. There are cool decapitation and dismemberment moves that you can do to finish them off. I do like the story of both, but I prefer the story in Warrior Within. The time travel in that is really well done. The twists and turns that you go through in the story. The Dahaka, oh my god, the Dahaka, one of the best characters in any game ever. And in case you still didn't know this to this day, The Dahaka is the true final boss of the game if you get the correct ending. Truly, truly spectacular game. And then the Two Thrones came along and it's not as good, but it's still good. The main problem with the Two Thrones is it's a bit more buggy than the others. Particularly with the free running aspects, you often find yourself failing on certain sections of free running and falling to your death, even though it was not your fault. You did everything correctly, but the game just fucks you over. That's annoying. But all in all, story was good, the game was good, mechanics were good in general, but the other two games were better than it. The whole trilogy, though, works well as a trilogy, truly one of my favourite trilogies, and that is apparent in the fact that I've stuck it in the top 10 best of all time, so of course it's one of my favourites. But Warrior Within in particular is one of my favourite games, and that is the reason that the whole Sans trilogy is making it into this top 10. Oh, I didn't even get into the Wraith. The Wraith was cool. And lastly, the final franchise on this list, Star Wipe. Hey guys, this is Brad from the future just editing the video that you're watching now, and I've just realised that I somehow, and I have no idea how I did this, but I somehow managed to completely omit a game from the list. If you're paying attention, then when I just say the final game, that is the 9th game I've mentioned, and it should be a top 10. And I don't know how I managed to completely skip past this, well, I say game franchise. I don't understand how I did it, and I'm trying to think back to when I recorded and how that might have happened, and I just don't know. But the other franchise, and because I'm not drinking during this bit, I'll try and keep this really brief. The other franchise is Mortal Kombat. I'm a big Mortal Kombat fan. I love the series. I love the lore. I love the characters. Most of the characters and their own individual backstories are all really fascinating to me. And the game itself, the gameplay is just fun, exciting. The gore and the violence, that really speaks to me. I love a bit of gore and violence, me. And the fatalities are just phenomenal. In fact, the fatalities are probably the reason it's my favourite fighting game franchise. If I'm going into a fighter, then I want all-out violence. That's what I want. And Mortal Kombat just delivers that completely. Also, I've got the newest film on Blu-ray, and I think this is a really, really good attempt at adapting the game to a movie. The fighting in it's good, the effects in it are good, the cast of characters are fun, and it's a good time, and you can tell that the people making it are definitely fans of the franchise and wanted to make fans happy. Although for nostalgic reasons, I probably do prefer the original film from before, because that was just, God, that's cheesy, but it's a great time. My favourite character from Mortal Kombat, it always seems to be narrowed down whenever people have a favourite character from Mortal Kombat. I know there are exceptions to this rule, but in general it tends to be Scorpion or Sub-Zero. Those are the two main ones. They are the faces of the franchise, and it's always just a toss-up between those two, and that's the sort of war going on between fans. Which side are you on, Scorpion or Sub-Zero? I love them both, absolutely, but Sub-Zero is my favourite. Ever since I first got into the franchise, I've just loved the character of Sub-Zero, and he's the one I normally play as, and he's great. But Scorpion's great too, and so are many, many of the others. Obviously, you gotta love the classic spine rip fatality as well. When they rebooted the franchise back in 2010, I think it was, somewhere around then anyway, that game is one of the very, very few that I actually bought the collector's edition of, because I don't normally tend to bother forking out the extra money for a collector's edition of something. As long as I get the game, I'm happy. Sometimes I'll pay a bit extra for, say, a deluxe version, so I get more game content. But collector's editions, the kind of stuff that comes with physical things for you to just keep in your home and stuff, they're nice, but I don't normally tend to bother going for that. But when that game came out and I saw the little model of Sub-Zero and Scorpion fighting, and Scorpion's got his spear out through Sub-Zero, and it's great. I've actually got it still in the box that it comes in, because it's got a little window on the front so you can see it. And it's just on the side over there. I've had it there for years and it's not moving anytime soon. So yeah, big fan of the Mortal Kombat franchise. I've been a big fan ever since I was far too young to play a game like that. And I don't know why I didn't say it while recording the video. I genuinely have no idea, but here we are. I can't do the whole thing again, so I'm just going to have to slip this in now. But anyway, I'll let you get back to Past Brad, and he will tell you about the final game on this list of top 10 video game franchises. Star Wipe. And lastly, the final franchise on this list. Now, if you're watching this video, Aidan, you don't need to worry. If this wasn't on the list, then it would have been in the honourable mentions, and as it wasn't, that proves that it's going to be in the list. The final game on this list is the Crash Bandicoot franchise. Now, the reason I did that little message direct to Aidan is because I'm pretty sure if he was to do a top 10, this would be his number one. Aidan is a massive fan of Crash Bandicoot, has been ever since he was a child. I have never seen anyone race the tracks on Crash Team Racing like that man does. And me, myself, personally, I'm not as good at the games as he is, but I fucking love them. Ever since I was a child, I played the demo of Crash Bandicoot 2 on the PlayStation 1, and I absolutely loved that. And then since then I played the actual game. I actually played Crash Bandicoot 2 before playing Crash Bandicoot 1 and 3, or Crash Bandicoot Warped. I have the disc to that on PlayStation 1 over there in the corner of my room, even though I have the Insane trilogy now, which, even though the original PlayStation 1 games are absolutely still phenomenal games to this day and definitely still hold up despite the graphics being really outdated, they're still great games. The Insane trilogy is the best way to play them. It is a truly astounding remake. Vicarious Visions did a wonderful job with that. Crash Team Racing, I've always said, is the best kart racer of all time. Better than any Mario Kart game, come at me. And that was absolutely 100% true until Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled came out and ended up being even better somehow. But yeah, the original Naughty Dog games on PS1, some of the best games ever made. And then when they all eventually got remade on the PlayStation 4 and other consoles of that generation, they got improved even further somehow. And graphically they look gorgeous now, they really, really do. And yeah, they're just truly wonderful, wonderful games. And then they made a Crash Bandicoot 4, which was not Wrath of Cortex. It was just a new Crash Bandicoot game with a numbered title, claiming to be a direct sequel to 3, which means that everything from Wrath of Cortex onwards didn't happen according to this game. And you know what? I'm okay with that. Especially if what happened in those games is being replaced with Crash Bandicoot 4. Because Crash Bandicoot 4 is probably the best Crash Bandicoot game that has ever been made. It is truly, truly great. I may have actually said that in the video where I talk about video game mascots. I don't remember everything I've ever said, but I think I did touch upon this in that video. Crash Bandicoot 4 is probably my favourite Crash Bandicoot game of all time. Truly, truly astounding. If you just play the game to enjoy the game and enjoy the story and the levels and all that, it is the best Crash Bandicoot game, hands down. If you're trying to 100% complete the game, that is, collect everything, all the crates, all the gems, all the relics, 100% of the trophies, it is the most difficult Crash Bandicoot game that's ever been made, and you are going to hate it by the end of it. I haven't completed it myself 100%. Fuck that, I never will. But just playing it for the enjoyment of it, for the story of it, it is the best Crash Bandicoot game ever, and one of the best games ever. And the franchise, particularly the original PS1 games and their remakes and Crash Bandicoot 4, definitely worthy of being in the top 10 franchises of all time. Absolutely, 100%. So that is my top 10 favourite video game franchises of all time. Again, as I said at the start, this is subject to change constantly. But that is officially what it is for now, and I'm going to stick by it. So yeah, I hope you're happy with how this video turned out, Rich. This is for you. And now that the drink is done, which, you know, it was a nice drink, by the way, Rich. I know you wanted me to hate it, but I do actually quite like a bit of Newcastle Brown from time to time, so haha. Anyway, time to cross it off the poster, so let me just get the angle sorted for you. That's That's one of the best crosses I've done so far. Nice and thick on both lines. I'm really happy with that. More happy than I should be, but there we go. So anyway, that was Newcastle Brown Ale. That was my top 10 video game franchises of all time, and that is a video. Thank you very much, Richard, for the suggestion. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope everyone else watching enjoyed this. And I hope that you've been watching and enjoying the whole series. And if you have, then please subscribe to the channel to find out when more of them get uploaded, and you can watch and enjoy those as well. And if you do like them, please make sure that you press like down below so that I know that you like them. And if you don't like them, feel free to press dislike. That way I know that you don't like them, and I'm still going to keep doing them. Fuck what you think. But I won't be offended if you do press the dislike button, so please press whichever one is relevant to you. Also, leave a comment down below. Tell me what your favourite video game or video game franchise is of all time. Even do a top 10 if you want to. It is difficult to narrow it down to top 10, I know that from personal experience, but you know, if you want to do that, do that. But if you just want to stick to your absolute favourite, then I am very interested to find out what you like. Also, as I said at the start, leave a comment if you have any suggestions for topics for me to talk about. Because I have pointed this out in earlier videos, and I will say it again, there are a lot of beers on this poster, and I do not have planned topics for all of them. I'm going to run out of things to say, so any suggestions you have will be very, very helpful. It's about time I did a proper burp in this video. Anyway, thank you very, very much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the next one.